Some people move through the world as quiet observers, standing a few steps back from the places where others rush forward. They are present, but not fully seen, involved, yet never fully immersed. They watch life unfold the way someone watches a shoreline from a cliff above it, close enough to feel the wind, far enough to avoid the pull of the waves. There is a softness to them, a slow, contemplative rhythm that others rarely notice. But beneath that calm distance lives a deeper story, a story about safety, a story about longing, a story about people who learn to understand the world by watching it more than participating in it. This film explores the psychology of those who feel safer observing life from afar, tracing the emotional landscapes that shape their quiet vantage point. The moment distance. BGI and NESM patterns begin so quietly that a person does not feel them forming. They simply notice one day that they stand at the edges of conversations, that they enjoy listening more than speaking, that they feel more comfortable noticing than being noticed. The distance feels natural. It feels peaceful. It feels like breath. But beneath that calm surface, something subtle is happening. The person begins to realize they have always been a watcher, the one who absorbs the room before stepping into it, the one who waits for others to reveal themselves before revealing anything back, the one who understands people deeply yet remains a mystery to most. This chapter opens with that recognition, not a dramatic moment, but an accumulating awareness. It often begins in childhood or adolescence. A young person sits quietly among louder personalities. They hear the unspoken tension in the house long before anyone addresses it. They sense emotional currents in ways others overlook. They become attuned to subtleties, to small shifts in tone, to unspoken needs. Observation becomes second nature because it feels safe. It feels predictable. It feels like a way to survive. With time, this habit transforms into identity. They become the one who blends into the background during group settings, offering insight only when it feels necessary. They enjoy being included but feel drained by too much engagement. They find meaning in watching how people move, how relationships unfold, how emotions ripple beneath the surface of everyday interactions. There is often a moment when they realize that life has continued without asking them to step fully into it. They date lightly but carefully. They form friendships but protect their deepest truth. They stay behind the camera instead of in front of it. They become the steady listener instead of the one who confides. They take in the world without demanding anything from it. And yet, beneath this distance, there is a quiet ache. Not the ache of loneliness, but the ache of longing for a way to be close without feeling exposed. The ache of wanting connection while fearing the cost of stepping into the center of things. The ache of watching life with tenderness while not fully believing they belong in its unfolding chaos. This chapter sets the emotional foundation. Distance is not avoidance. It is a refuge, a vantage point, a place where the person feels they can breathe. But it is also the beginning of a silent struggle, one that unfolds slowly and quietly as their life continues from the edges, rather than the center. Where this distance, BGA in distance, rarely appears out of nowhere. It has a history. It grows from the emotional soil of early life. Children do not choose to become observers. They learn to become observers because direct participation felt overwhelming, unsafe, or unpredictable. They learn to shrink their presence to avoid drawing attention. They learn to read their environment before speaking, because speaking too soon once led to something painful. Some grew up in homes where emotions were unstable. A parent's mood could shift quickly, turning affection into tension without warning. The child learned to stay alert, to watch, to sense. They became skilled at noticing the slightest cues, because clarity protected them. Observation became a shield. Others grew up invisible, not disliked, but overlooked. They learned that staying quiet created fewer waves than trying to compete for attention that rarely arrived. They settled into the background because the background felt familiar. It felt expected. There are those who grew up around louder siblings, more dominant personalities, or environments that rewarded compliance rather than expression. Their quietness was praised. Their independence was admired. Their silence was interpreted as maturity. They learned that being low maintenance earned approval, and so they continued shaping themselves into someone who required little. Some children grew up with emotional responsibility placed on them far too early. They were the peacekeepers, the ones who mediated, the ones who softened tension simply by existing. They learned to observe because observing allowed them to predict conflict and avoid becoming the reason for it. Comfort came from watching rather than participating. And then there are those who grew up sensitive to noise, to emotion, to the intensity of other people's presence. They withdrew into their inner landscape because it felt calmer, more manageable, more forgiving. This chapter traces these emotional origins with compassion. Distance is not a flaw. It is a survival strategy shaped by years of adapting. The person who feels safer watching life from afar is often the person who learned early that closeness comes with complexity, and observation comes with clarity. Their distance is not coldness. It is the imprint of the environments that shaped them. The science behind the OBSR VR psychology offers several explanations for why some people naturally take on the role of the observer. Attachment research shows that children who experienced inconsistent emotional responses often develop patterns of cautious engagement. Their brains learn to scan their environment for cues before responding. This hyper-awareness becomes a lifelong skill, but it also becomes a barrier to spontaneous connection. Neuroscience explains that highly sensitive individuals process information more deeply than others. Their nervous systems respond strongly to external stimuli. Crowds feel overwhelming. Loud voices feel intrusive. Fast-paced social dynamics feel draining. The brain begins prioritizing distance because distance reduces sensory and emotional overload. Some individuals develop avoidant coping patterns, not because they fear people, but because they fear being consumed by the emotional demands of others. Their emotional energy is limited, and observing feels less risky than participating. Participation requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires trust. Trust requires history. Observation requires none of these. There is also a phenomenon known as self-distancing. People who rely on reflective thinking often take a step back from their experiences to understand them better. This becomes a psychological habit. They analyze before they act. They reflect before they respond. They watch before they join. Over time, this cognitive distance blends with emotional distance. They become the person who processes their feelings privately, who rarely reacts impulsively, who waits until the moment feels safe before showing any part of themselves. This chapter explores the psychological underpinnings that make observation feel natural. It reveals that watching from a distance is not avoidance, but a form of emotional regulation. It is a strategy shaped by personality traits, nervous system sensitivity, and learned patterns of self-protection. The distance is not emptiness. It is a carefully calibrated space where they can breathe, think, and remain anchored. The inner conflict of the quiet OBCR. Inside the quiet observer lives a tension that few people ever see. They long to be included, yet feel overwhelmed by closeness. They crave understanding, yet fear being misunderstood. They want to participate, yet feel safest holding space just outside the circle. This conflict becomes most visible in relationships. They enjoy deep conversation but fear revealing too much of themselves. They want connection but retreat when someone gets too close. They want to be chosen but feel unprepared to be fully seen. They want to be understood without having to translate the quiet language of their inner world. Often they feel both lonely and relieved by their loneliness. They yearn for intimacy, yet the idea of being emotionally exposed feels uncomfortable. They watch others build friendships quickly while they remain cautious, slow to trust, slow to unfold. They may blame themselves for being detached, but the truth is more complex. They simply need more time, more space, more safety than most people realize. This distance creates misunderstandings. Others may see them as aloof or uninterested, but beneath their calm exterior is a heart that feels deeply, often too deeply, which is why it hides. They worry about taking up space. They worry about being misunderstood. They worry about becoming dependent on someone who may not stay. Their inner conflict is subtle but constant. They want to speak but hesitate. They want to reach out but freeze. They want to be held but fear collapsing if they allow themselves to lean. This chapter reveals the quiet battles inside the observer. Their distance is not a wall. It is a negotiation between longing and caution, connection and self-preservation. It is the fragile balance between wanting to belong and wanting to feel safe. The moment something shifts, there comes a point when the distance begins to feel heavy. Not because the person wants to abandon it, but because they recognize the cost of observing life rather than living it. The realization is often quiet. It may come during a late night of reflection, or in the silence after a missed opportunity, or in the ache of watching someone they care about drift away due to the emotional gap. They never learn to close. They begin noticing patterns. They see how often they softened their voice, how many times they stepped aside, how often they kept their feelings private until they dissolved into numbness. They see how many connections faded, not because they lacked depth, but because they never allowed their depth to be visible. The shift is not dramatic. It is a gentle awakening, a subtle recognition that distance can protect them, but it can also isolate them. They start questioning the stories they learned early in life. Stories about not needing anything, stories about being safer alone, stories about staying small to avoid being hurt. This chapter explores the quiet turning point. When the observer begins to acknowledge their own longing, it does not force them into action. It simply brings awareness. The awareness that beneath their distance lives a desire to be known, a desire to be understood, a desire to participate in life in ways they once believed were not meant for them. The shift is not about abandoning distance. It is about choosing when distance serves them and when it holds them back. It is about noticing the moments when they want to step closer, even if only by a breath. It is about recognizing that life can be watched, but it can also be lived. Slowly and gently, and without losing the safety they have always protected. The gentle practice of opening is not a single act. It is a slow practice, a series of small decisions that begin to reshape the way the observer moves through the world. They start by allowing themselves to be seen in small ways, a truth shared, a feeling admitted, a vulnerability expressed in a quiet voice. They begin to trust people who show consistency, people who make space without pressure, people who understand silence without interpreting it as rejection. These relationships become places where the observer feels safe enough to take small steps forward. They learn that connection does not demand the surrender of their solitude. It simply invites them to share pieces of it. Opening does not erase their need for distance. It simply softens it. They learn that presence is not dangerous, that being understood is possible, that revealing themselves in small pieces does not lead to collapse. They begin to see that their depth is not a burden. It is a language, and some people are fluent in it. This chapter explores how healing unfolds quietly. Opening is not about becoming someone else. It is about allowing themselves to exist more fully. It is about integrating their inner world with their outer life. It is about learning that they can observe and participate. They can watch and belong. They can remain themselves and still be held. A quiet CONCLOCO in the end. The psychology of people who feel safer watching life from a distance is not a story of avoidance. It is a story of sensitivity, of survival, of deep perception shaped by years of learning the world through careful eyes. Their distance is not emptiness, it is awareness. Their caution is not coldness, it is self-protection. Their observation is not disconnection, it is a way of understanding the world before they enter it. This film closes with a gentle truth. Those who watch life from afar are not separate from it. They are simply moving at a different rhythm, a rhythm shaped by memory, by intuition, by a quiet desire to feel safe in a world that often moves too loudly. Some hearts participate by stepping forward, others participate by watching closely. Both ways are human, both ways are valid, both belong,